The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Callie Olson. I am back. Comfortably Zoned Radio, Lovin baseball when we were 12 and innocent. And I have as usual, an interesting guest. In this case, more than interesting. He's a fellow author, and I might add, a friend. So please help me welcome Eric C. Gray.
Thank you, Ralph. Good to be back with you.
First question, what's the C for? I think you told me, but I forget.
The C is for Christopher, which,
Christopher.
As you imagine, is a fairly unusual name for a Jewish guy, but it's
well,
my name
that's
nevertheless.
There are not, it's not a rule, let's put it this way. You don't have to be named Moskowitz or Schlemiel to be a Jew. You know,
Right.
You could be anything. All right, my friend, let's talk a little. When you were age 12, the title of the podcast is Comfortably Zoned when Lovin baseball when you were 12 and innocent. I'll ask you, were you innocent at 12?
Yeah, I've pretty much been innocent most of my life, unfortunately. But
Okay.
yes, I was. Yes, I was.
Is that when you first started loving baseball, when intellect met enthusiasm and fandom?
You know, people ask about my baseball lineage in terms of teams, because I started as a Yankee fan, then I became a Mets fan, which I still am, but of course now I'm a Giants fan. I was 5 when the Giants and Dodgers left New York, and you know, I mean, at 5 years old, I wasn't really kind of paying that much attention. But when I started, really following baseball, the only team that was in town was the Yankees. And when you're 8 or 9 or 10 or 12, and you've got Mickey Mantle running around center field and hitting home runs, you know, what more could you possibly ask for? And
I know, I'm jealous.
Yeah.
I never took to the Yankees when the Giants and Dodgers moved, and I see a lot of games, but I didn't really have a rooting interest until later when I got to review the situation and realized we were watching some great baseball. And just because my Giants had left, I should not have punished myself and been more enthusiastic at that time. You mentioned Mickey Mantle first. Was he the end all for you at that as a kid?
Mantle, yeah. I mean, he was the one. I mean, he's one of 3 idols I've had in my life. I mean, it kind of astonishes me that I don't remember seeing him play, although I know I did. I mean, in person, I don't have any of those particular memories. But one of my stories in my book is about my going to the game when they retired Mickey Mantle's number, and I remember very little about that day. I just remember where I was sitting. It was the upper deck on the third base line, and such a vivid memory of him driving around the field on that golf cart, you know, to what seemed like a 4-hour standing ovation. And so, yeah,
Eric,
that was
there is a YouTube recreation of that moment. The entire event, including DiMaggio presenting the plaque and different players from each era at each position. He was the most well-loved Yankee in history.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably. I mean, I suppose DiMaggio fans might disagree, or maybe Ruth or Gehrig, but certainly was the most beloved Yankee in my lifetime. And I'm just very grateful that I was able to get to that game. I don't remember anything about it. I don't remember the game. I don't remember who I was with. It had to be my dad because I was only 16. But I sure remember being in that seat and watching and cheering as he drove around the field. It was just a memory seared into my brain.
Eric, what about those days and being a baseball fan in those days do you miss most? Do you miss, what about baseball in those days as compared to the way the game has evolved? There are things to love about it today as well. But let's start with what you loved about the game in yesteryear.
I don't really pay that much attention to how the game has evolved in terms of better or worse. I mean, I'm not wild about all the attention to sabermetrics and, the shifts and all that. I understand why they are. I don't really care. I guess what I would say is back then it was less about the game than it was about, you didn't have a lot of other, things to worry about. You thought about the baseball game. You could just be a bigger fan without wondering about things like steroids or why you might not like a certain baseball player. It was just, you kind of used the word at the very beginning of the talk. It was just really more about innocence. And when you're 8 or 10 or 12 years old, you don't have a lot of things that you're worrying about. You're not worrying about all those extraneous things that we would think about as adults.
Right. Did you have a debate forum with your friends as a kid? Mickey Mantle, Duke Snyder, Willie Mays, that type of thing. Did you discuss baseball much as a kid?
I think I don't remember. I mean, we obviously played all the time, whether it was on a baseball field, whether it was, and I'm not even talking about things like Little League. I'm just talking about the friends you hung out with. Whether it was stickball, which of course, as you know, is that drawing a box on a wall and it's 1-on-1 or 2-on-2, or whether
right.
it was just playing in the street. We played all the time, and we did a lot of trading of baseball cards. I don't really remember having the discussion. I more remember going to games with friends, like when we were in high school and you could take the Long Island Railroad out to Shea Stadium. I know we talked baseball because if we played it, we talked it, but I don't really recall that very well.
Okay. What was your dad like? You mentioned he brought you to games that you remember. What did he pass on to you as a fan? He was a Yankee fan, you'd say?
No, he actually he became a Red Sox fan. In fact, there's a story in the book it's from my uncle, and it's about listening with my dad and their other brother to the second ever All-Star game when Carl Hubble struck out 5 murderers row. And what my uncle says is that my dad was probably a Giants fan at the time. My dad wasn't an enthusiastic baseball fan. I mean, he liked it. He took my brother and I to games, a couple of times a year. I mean, it's not like he loved the game, but my dad was just a very unusual man for his generation about how emotional and loving he was. And he did things that he knew that we would like to do. And, skip ahead, 50 years. My daughter runs the press elevator at the Giants Park, and she's a big baseball fan. And one of her, if not her favorite ball players was Jeff Kent. And my dad would always find articles in the newspaper about Jeff Kent and send them to her. And again, It wasn't because of him loving baseball. I mean, he liked it. He didn't dislike the game. He wasn't passionate about it, but he did this because he knew that's what his family in this particular case, that's what my daughter, what it would mean to her.
That's a touching story. My dad was so far removed from baseball and what was going on that I envy you having his spirit. Let's put it that way.
I was very, very lucky.
Yes, and how much of it is life is being in the right place at the right time, and it's fate oftentimes, but you get to pass on a lot of that. What do you pass on to your kids that you got from him directly?
Well, I mean, I certainly think that, not in a baseball sense, but,
No, just in life.
Being present, being there, being involved, being emotional, never being afraid to talk about your feelings and sharing stuff. I mean, I go to DC, well, not the last 3 years because of COVID, but I go to DC almost every year to take my son to see the Giants play the Nationals. He doesn't need me to take him, but that's what we do. And back, I guess it was 2017, again, before everything started to happen, my daughter, my wife, my daughter, my son and his wife, we all met in Arizona for spring training. And it was just that feeling of all being together, in this case, baseball. This has been something that's been discussed in both of my books, in my narratives. Baseball is something that has literally kept our family. It hasn't kept us together, but it's certainly been one of the primary bonds. We've always got baseball to keep us together.
It's the thread that runs through you.
It is.
All of you. And,
it is. We're all big baseball fans. You were asking me what have I passed down. I mean, I certainly have passed down the love of the game. I talk about that in the introduction to my first book, which was about the first game I took my kids to. And Rachel, who knew she'd be bored this game and brought about 200 books to read, she never read a single word of any of her books. She was just enchanted by the game from the very beginning, and I taught them about the history. So when she met Orlando Cepeda in the press elevator, and he was talking to her. He'd been in the elevator several times, and he finally said to her, "My name is Orlando," with a long pause, Cepeda. And she kind of smiled at him and shook her head, and she said, "I know who you are." I mean, I kind of passed that down. I taught them not only to like Will Clark or Mike Krukow, who were playing when they started to pay attention, but to learn the history of the Giants and, frankly, of Major League Baseball.
You told me a story of Mike Krukow. You were talking to Mike Krukow and Dwayne Kuiper and asked them whether they knew your daughter. And
right.
What a thrill that was for you when they were sincerely, they weren't just talking the words, they knew her. And that's the kind,
right.
that's my the kind of people they are, by the way. Krukow, they are people, person people, if you know what I mean. And that made you, I saw you light up and telling that story. We had lunch, and it's one of my favorite stories in baseball, books notwithstanding. The look in your eye of a connect with them, a connect with your daughter, a connect with each other, with the Giants. Terrific. Now I'll ask you, because I'm an old New York Giant fan and a Met fan. When the Mets played the Giants, are you conflicted?
Yeah, sure I am.
Yeah.
And what I have, I time my, well, again, it's changed since COVID, but I time my visits to New York, which are kind of every other year, to when the Giants were either playing the Mets or the Yankees. And what I have, again, is a story in the first book that talks about
the Nats are playing the Mets or the Yankees.
No, I go back to New York when the Giants are playing there. I go to DC.
Okay. I thought we were still talking about Washington with your son.
No, that's a different thing. I was going every year to take him to see the Giants there. In the first book, I talk about the 2000 World Series, or not the World Series, but the playoffs when the Giants faced the Mets, and my kids basically said, "All right, Dad, which is it, the light side or the dark side?" So I basically have come to the point where when the Giants and Mets are playing each other, I will root for the team that needs it most. If one team is, 30 games out and not going anywhere, I'll root for the other team. I'm a fan of both teams. What can I say?
You mentioned Jeff Kent, and that makes it easy to be a fan of both teams. He had terrific experiences with New York and with San Francisco.
It's kind of hard for me to understand why Kent isn't getting more attention to the Hall of Fame. I mean, I don't know that he should be a lock, but I mean, he gets like 15 or 18%, and one of the kind of unwritten, not requirements, but one of the unwritten expectations for Hall of Fame consideration is that you dominated your position for an extended period of time, and he certainly did offensively for between 6 and 8 years, and I don't understand why he gets so little vote count.
Yeah.
I don't.
If you want to argue Kent, just bring up the fact that he improved defensively radically over the years. He started out as not a good fielding second baseman, and it turned in he was very, very competent.
Yeah, I always thought that he was fine as a second baseman. His range may not have been great, but what he got to, he handled pretty well. I don't recall him as being a bad fielding second baseman. So I don't know why he's not getting consideration. I don't get it, but I'm not a voter. So what can I say?
Okay, Eric, would you tell me a story or two from your book?
Sure. Let me. Can I explain a little bit about what the book is?
Please.
So this is my second book, and you obviously know, Ralph, you have the first one, and you've interviewed me before. Both books are collections of stories from people from around the world about their experiences that in one way or another touch upon baseball. They aren't necessarily heavy on play of game. There certainly is some of that, but far more, they are human interest stories that in one way or another, as I said, touch upon baseball. Some don't even happen at a game. They are stories that make people laugh and make you tear up. And what I always say is they just make you remember. And it was so common that I would get a story from somebody and just kind of reflect back on my life and say, well, that happened to me, or something like that happened to me. And they're just wonderful memories from people. Let me read what I think is, in a way, a perfect story for this book because, sorry, apologize. We're not post-COVID yet, but given that so much of this book was put together during COVID times, this story just seemed to be a perfect fit. And it's in the chapter called Home Runs, which are just stories that are, just out of the park. And here it is. I just wanted to have a catch. After reading the history of baseball, I'm sorry, I've got something in my throat. Well, that's really elegant on your podcast. After reading the history,
we are natural. This is not. We're very informal. Cough away. If you want me to take a break,
I think I'm fine. Okay. Thank you. I always call it when I used to do training for work. Just before I was to go on, I would I'd find myself going, like I always called it trainer's throat. So I think I'm there now. I just wanted to have a catch. After reading the history of baseball in 10 pitches, with ball in hand, I, a former college pitcher, just wanted to try some of the grips, the slider, the curve, even though I hadn't thrown a ball in decades. I needed someone who could catch a hard one or one in the dirt. I didn't know anyone who could do that. So, like a mother looking after her kid, my wife, Alice, a baseball fan in her own right, posted on the neighborhood app Nextdoor, asking for someone who might want to have that catch. The responses started flowing in. A woman called for her son, followed by a couple of guys, all enthusiastic. Another wrote, "What a wonderful way to bring people together and start 2021 with a positive note. This makes me smile." Alice, in a follow-up post, wanting to ensure that this show would go on, suggested a time and place. We showed up early, not really sure if anyone would come. Comments aren't commitments, especially when they are online. I brought some baseballs and an old catcher's mitt, which I had repaired that morning. And then people started to arrive. 3 students from the North Dallas High School team came with a staff member, a 26-year-old guy, a 73-year-old man from Queens, New York, and several others in between. There was even a spectator in the bunch, as well as a reporter from the local ABC affiliate. Hellos were said, lines formed, and balls started being thrown back and forth, like kids at a Little League practice. But something more started to happen between the catches and the misses. People started talking to each other about life, their own lives. Connections were made, perhaps friendships, time will tell. My new friend, Rich, when asked why he came, he simply said, "Fountain of youth, the opportunity to do something I never expected to do again in my life." The first session ended. Some of us were exhausted with tired arms and wobbly legs, having not thrown a ball in decades. But I think it's fair to say that most of us were energized. It remains to be seen if these wannabe stars and old Diamond Warriors will continue to meet. But important things had happened. People had gotten another shot at past glories. They'd gotten a chance to do something nice to usher in a year with little more hope than the one just left behind. I plan to do what I can to get some positive attention for the respectful, wonderful kids in that local high school who sometimes get blamed for minor incidents in the community. Alice, look what you've done. And that's from Frank Miller in Dallas, Texas.
Nice. It
just seemed like, the timing of that story to this book was perfect.
Wow. Can't top that, but try. Another story.
Sure. And what I have to do is, there are always stories that I seem to read over and over again when I do book readings, as I'm going to be doing next week in a tour of the Midwest. And I try to read different stories, but inevitably there are a couple of stories that get read almost every time. And what I realized just now as I'm reading that story, I have to call Frank and find out if, in fact, some of those relationships have continued. Okay, nice. Well, we were talking before, Ralph, about the connection of baseball with my family, and I think this story describes that perfectly. This is one of mine in the book. After over 50 years and attending hundreds of ball games, I had still never seen a no-hitter. I wasn't there on June 13, 2012, when Matt Cain stepped onto the AT&T mound, but I was watching on TV. My wife, Lynn, and I watched the whole thing, and our daughter, Rachel, was working at the park as usual for home games. As our collective favorite player, Matt Cain, was tossing more and more zeros, 0 hits, 0 runs, 0 errors, 0 walks, the tension and anxiety began to rise in our household. From 3,000 miles away, 4-way text began with our son David, who knew he should be going to sleep, but couldn't pass on the chance to watch history being made. Gregor Blanco's catch in the 7th was the first breathtaking moment. For the last play, a tough hop to Joaquin Arias, who had replaced Panda for defensive purposes, made him step backward, taking away any momentum from toward first. The play was made. Cain pumped his fist, and then came the phone call, a very brief one at 1 a.m. or so, from David. This was history, just a 20-second perfect game ever. It was our favorite player who had accomplished this feat, and it was obvious that once again, this magical game of baseball had connected the four of us, from our home in San Francisco to the press elevator in the park to an apartment in D.C. to the pitcher's mound. 5 years later, Lynn and I got tickets to the last game of the 2017 season. Lynn likes to go to this game, Fan Appreciation Day, at which prizes are given away like water to racers in a marathon, and players throw a ball into the stands after the game. But we went that day because we knew this was the last game Matt Cain would ever pitch. Several years of ineffectiveness, caused in part by the injuries that suddenly plagued this once impervious horse, had resulted in his decision at the relatively young age of 33 to hang him up rather than keep pushing to regain a past magic. We knew he would get the start one last time after half a season of doing bullpen mop-up work. He did, and he was magnificent, reaching back and pitching like the Matt Cain of old. And, fittingly, befitting the term coined from his name, he got caned, receiving no run support. He pitched 5 innings, the last reputedly on fumes and adrenaline, and took the loss. Still our guy, I thought, as today I watched the ceremonies inducting him onto the Giants Wall of Fame. It still makes me a little teary when I read this story. He will be my last ever favorite player.
Wow, that's good. Did you ever get to share your feelings with Matt Cain?
No, but I've been trying to figure out a way how to do that, because there are actually in the book, there are 3 other accounts from people who were at the game. And I've just not really made the connection with the Giants for how to – there are a lot of stories I want to get to players, you know, and I imagine I could do that through the Giants PR department, and I really have to do that because I want them to have this story. I mean, there's a story in the first book about a guy that I met at a coffee shop in New York, and it was about his epic effort to get David Ortiz to sign his book, and it was a happy ending to it, but it was just an amazing tale. And I want Ortiz to have that story. I want him to know that what a difference he made to somebody. So that's kind of one of my projects that I really have to get on.
Off your subject a little, you mentioned the panda, and
right.
That was quite a character for the Giants. He was like a 50th round draft choice, not expected to make it. Wasn't even in the book of prospects when he was at San Jose. Just tell me a little bit about the panda as you see his career with the Giants in front of you.
Well, you know, they brought him up, I think it was in 2007. And if my memory is correct, he actually came up as a third-string catcher, or maybe he came up as an infielder, but knowing that he was a backup catcher. And, I mean, I don't remember what his future was predicted to be. I mean, I believe what you said, which is that they weren't really high expectations for him. But, you know, he's a guy that just captured Giants fans. I mean, it's like Posey, right? I mean, it's like Lincecum. It's like there are certain characters. I mean, Cain was my favorite. He obviously wasn't, you know, the sexy choice of people. Lincecum was a character. Panda was a character. And, you know, between the panda hats and his just loving to roll around the dirt and get filthy, and the smile on his face, and the chewing tobacco with a gum that was constantly getting spit out of his mouth. I mean, he endeared himself to fans. They just loved him, and he gave it all. And the smile on his face made it all worthwhile seeing him. Yeah, I mean, he loved to play. He really loved to play and to get dirty. And, you know, I think the only negative thing was I think he got some really bad advice when he became a free agent and left, and he made that really ill-stated comment about the only one he ever liked was Bruce Bochy and Hunter Pence. I think that was some really bad advice he was given. And as you know, he, thankfully not irrevocably, but he burned some bridges there when he left.
Yeah. Sometimes it's just out of the sorrow of leaving the organization, and it must have been horrible for him. He was a Giant right from the start. And,
right. It was sorrow, bad advice, probably immaturity. My recollection is that they offered him a pretty hefty contract and he declined. So, some of that was on him. But it was good that they brought him back, and he did contribute for a while, and that it was really nice to lead, to bring back that good taste in the mouths and eyes and memories of Giants fans.
Good. Hey, let me bring up a family connect with baseball for me. Quick story. I'm 10 years old. Don Lawson is in the midst of pitching a perfect game, and I came home, and my mother was there, and we got to watch the last few innings. We got to watch Yogi run into the arms of Lawson, or vice versa. I don't remember what it was. I think Lawson picked up Yogi. But my point was, I said, I to my mother, I said, this is the first time I'm seeing you enjoy baseball. And she said, let me tell you a story. When I was 19, in 1939, living in Mount Kisco, New York, my girlfriend and I copped some tickets to a Yankee game, and it happened to be the Yankee game when Lou Gehrig was giving his famous "I'm the luckiest guy in the world."
Oh my God!
And I said, "You saw that?" I certainly did, she said. And I later on in life, that story stuck with me. Later on in life, when I started doing podcasting, I brought George Case III into my network, into my podcast network. And his dad, George Case Sr., no, it was George Case Jr., played with the Washington Senators and lined up that day when both teams lined up to see Lou Gehrig's speech. So my mother must have seen him. I mean, it's just passed him by in her line of vision, seeing the whole thing. Now, I cut to 1961. We went to Washington, D.C. on a family outing. And we went to see the Yankees play the Senators. It was not the original Senators, but it was a team, an expansion team, and George Case III was the coach. The junior was the third base coach in that game.
Right.
So she's been long gone, but I know that she got to see George Case that day as well, 61 from 1939.
Right.
And the connect for me was George Case has become part of my extended baseball and life family through the podcast network. And
sorry, no, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say that's how baseball is the connection between eras, between times, between what this member of the family knew, what he loved, what she loved. It's just been a great experience for me being a baseball fan and being associated with the game as I have been. So I understand what you're coming from and how the family comes when you think of what you saw. You think of the family, what they saw.
Yeah. Well, if you remember before, I told you that stories, at least I think I did, that often when I get a story, it reminds me of my own experiences. In this particular case, that day, Lou Gehrig Day, first of all, I'm asking you, why did you not write that story up so I could have put it in my second book? But there is a story, there are a couple of stories in the book about that day, and George Case is one of them. And George Case has stories in both of my books, and he gave me a whole series of stories about the experiences that his dad had. It's in the chapter called Stories Handed Down. And as you were talking about that Lou Gehrig Day, George has that story in it about his dad.
Wow, this is serendipity, I guess.
Well, it's a big world, but sometimes in the baseball world, as I'm finding out, there are, it's not as big as you would think.
And George Case, incidentally, was a big contributor to the book that George Grimm and I wrote, Comfortably Zoned in a Vat O' Pine Tar. Mm-hmm. So I love having you just as a fellow author, let alone a friend who is local, and I like you. You're true. You make eye contact. You're just a terrific guy, and I'm appreciative.
I'm so glad to have gotten to know you as well. Can I read one more quick story?
Please.
All right. This is from a woman who I got to know. She's from Seattle, and it's just a great story. So let me just get to it. Growing up a huge baseball fan in Idaho, it took advanced planning to see my favorite major leaguers in person. When I found out the 2001 Midsummer Classic was coming to Seattle, the closest major league city, I decided there was no way I wasn't going. This is before the secondary ticket market took off, so my best and only option was to sell tickets through Ticketmaster. On the day tickets went on sale, I stayed home from school and logged onto my slow dial-up internet, listening for the familiar modem beeps. Once online, I opened as many browsers as I could. I wanted 3 tickets so I could go with my parents, Jim and Joy. Over and over again, I hit the refresh button, only to see the no tickets available message repeatedly. Finally, a miracle struck, and 2 tickets appeared. I jumped on it. But now I was torn. I had 2 tickets in hand and had to decide which parent would accompany me to the game. In my infinite adolescent wisdom, I decided the most fair and impartial way to decide was to administer an exam. For the next few days, I laboriously assembled a baseball test, doing my best to provide an unbiased mix of questions spanning all players' eras. Fortunately, my parents were good sports, and they willingly took my baseball SAT. In the end, Mom had the edge and wound up as my all-star chaperone. It was a very memorable game, with 8 of my Mariners voted to the squad, and Cal Ripken winning the All-Star MVP in his final playing year. Sadly, Dad had to watch on TV from the confines of our Seattle hotel room. But don't worry, I've made it up to him in adulthood, taking multiple baseball trips with just him. And he didn't even have to take another exam. And that's from Emily Hawks in Seattle, Washington.
Wow. Have you stayed in touch with many of these people who contributed to your book? Absolutely.
One of my greatest joys is getting to meet them when I come to their area or if they get to San Francisco. Just yesterday, I know somebody in Walnut Creek who we stayed in touch with. He has stories in the books. More importantly, not only has his aunt and his wife's mom and daddy's given me a story, but Ari's mom gave me a story about, well, what pretty much would be Ari's first game. It's when she was pregnant with Ari. And the end of the story is, if that doesn't make him a lifetime baseball fan, I don't know what is. So I was able to meet these people that I, had never met. And on these upcoming trips, I will absolutely be meeting more. And I've got copies of my books that I call author signature copies. So I'm trying to get signatures from as many people who contributed to my books as I can. It's like a really prized keepsake for me.
Can you tell our audience where you'll be speaking with your book on your upcoming trip?
Sure. I'll try to make this really brief. In Minneapolis, I'm going to be speaking at Magers and Quinn on August 29th. It's at 6:30 or at 7 o'clock. In Milwaukee, I'm going to be at Renaissance Books at Southridge Mall on August 31st at 6:30. I will be doing a reading on 9/1 in Milwaukee at McGinn's All-Star Pub, also at 6:30. I will be doing a couple of readings in Chicago. They're private residences, so I would only give out the the addresses if people contact me. I'll be doing a couple of readings in Cleveland on 9/6 and 9/7. 9/6 will be at the Italian American Brotherhood Club, and those are the folks that were involved in getting the Rocky Colavito statue erected. And 9/7 at the North Royalton Library. And then in Pittsburgh, I will be at Riverstone Books at 6:30. So if I could give you my email address,
Yes.
people can contact me if they're in those cities, or if they have friends who are, or if they want to get my book. My email address it's a long one, but a simple one. So it's eric.baseballstories, plural. So ERIC.BASEBALLSTORIES, one word, at Gmail.
And they can contact you on Facebook as well.
Absolutely. My book is called Backyards to Ballparks. The first one is basis to bleachers, and I just like the alliteration. I mean, the fact that they're both all B's is just kind of an accident. But Backyards to Ballparks, more personal baseball stories from the stands and beyond. And if people are interested in my doing readings, if I'm going to be in their area, please let me know. In October, we're going to be in New York and New Jersey and maybe Philadelphia, but definitely Boston. I have an interview on NPR scheduled. And then later in the year, we're going to be going up to Seattle and Portland, and then going down to Los Angeles and probably over to Phoenix, where I will see, among other people, our mutual good friend, Rick Lenneberg.
Oh, yes. Tell me about you. We'll talk off the air about Rick. He's recovering from some surgery, and
he's doing well.
He's doing well. I'm in contact with him. He seems to be doing okay, and that's a blessing. He is, like you said, a mutual friend and a treasured friend. I'd just like to say good luck to Mark Littell, who wrote the foreword on my book and is going into the hospital for some heart surgery.
Oh.
And I just hope he makes it through. He's country and he's tough. So keep plugging Mark. Eric, what's your next project?
Well, after I spend a considerable amount of time. After all of this,
right. What's your next creative project?
At some point, there will probably be a third baseball book, but as you know, thank you for leading into this. My next project is I'm working on a book of similar nature, people's stories, but about concerts and music in general. I know I should never say something like this on a baseball program, but as much as I love baseball,
we're humans. We're talking about life, and your first love is music.
My first love is music.
And we don't always get along because you're a Beatles fan and I'm a Stones fan. It's not a right or wrong, but the Beatles never did anything with Muddy Waters.
Well, This is true.
Okay. So I gotta get you on some level.
Yeah, that will be my next project, collecting stories from people about their concert experiences or just about music in general, what it meant to them, or just something that's had an impact on them. I can't wait to really dive into this book.
Okay. Tell me something. Last time we had lunch, you talked about the documentary of the Beatles. Have you completed that? Watching that or listening to that?
I watched it as soon as it came out. It was something that I had heard. Well, I knew it was coming. I mean, it wasn't a big surprise. But before COVID, there were teasers or trailers in the theaters about that project. It was originally supposed to come out as just a movie, and then I don't know if it was because of COVID or whatever. He kind of changed direction, and he made that, as you know, that 8.5 hour project on Disney. And yeah, I watched the whole thing as quickly as I could, and it was amazing.
Good. Hey, Eric, thank you for being here. And
well, thank you for having me, Ralph.
I just want your promise that when your book on music comes out, we can do a podcast on that, because I'm mostly sports, mostly baseball, but mostly life. And I'd love to talk to you about your next book as well.
Anytime you want me on your show, Ralph, I'll be there.
Okay. Promise me you'll be safe on your trip.
That is my goal. It's really nice because we're going to places where we have friends and family. So while this is a quote-unquote business trip, and I don't even think of it in those terms because reading these stories is just a pleasure. But it's also a personal thing, so we get a chance to see friends and family, and that's a good thing.
Beautiful. His name is Eric C. Gray, and he's a terrific guest. Thank you for listening, everybody. I'm Ralph Tycho, obviously the weak link of it all. Be well, everybody. Adios and happy trails. Thank you again, Eric.
Thank you.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.